blind spots was that in the last 30 years, many of the most significant problems that we've decided we want to address as a society, we've addressed them successfully. I don't know if you've noticed, but cancer deaths in the last 30 years are down 35%. Traffic fatalities are down 25% over the last 30 years. And yet, engagement in the workplace has not moved one iota. So it's the same as it was 30 years ago. And so we really began to think about, so what's not working for us, and what are the potential blind spots that as leaders we might have that are holding us back from effectively leading our people. And Meg mentioned there are 5 blind spots, and really today we wanted to talk about just one. So in order to do that, we are going to start in talking about engagement. So the first slide you see is really sort of also from the book, and it's an interesting caricature or cartoon, and it's sort of a leader saying the future from A to Z, and we have an exciting future, right, guys? And the challenge is that they couldn't be less interested. And so the blind spot is that the rational and logical presentation engage people's hearts and minds. And, you know, and more often for leaders, that is our go-to, whether it's a town hall or whether it's, you know, an all-company meeting or whether it's an all-hands meeting. While there may be questions and some interaction, the majority of that is a direct tell and sell by leaders. And the challenge with that is that it simply doesn't work. As a matter of fact, there's an interesting guy, Ed Tufte, who I've been a fan of, where suggests that when you use fact, fear, and force, you can almost imagine the fact that PowerPoint actually corrupts. In other words, imagine a widely used drug that made us beautiful but doesn't. Instead, it had serious side effects, including stupidity, wasted time, degraded quality, and induces sleep behind the wheel. The side effect would rightly lead to a worldwide product recall. But in the case of the way that we engage our people, it hasn't. Yet these methods and approaches almost predictably are a yawner for our people. Maybe one way to think about it, I'm an old baby boomer, so you know there was an ad campaign in the 70s where it talked about drugs and your brain on drugs, and it was a fried egg. Maybe the best way to think about it is that, you know, our brains on PowerPoints looks like this, and our brains when engaged in stories have a very different dimension. Actually, there is neuroscience behind this. You know, it took neurology centuries to validate what prehistoric cave paintings knew, and that was that storytelling can change our attitudes, our beliefs, and our behaviors. As a matter of fact, there are actually 3 different hormones that are used to really influence our emotions: dopamine, serotonin, and oxytocin. And it's really the oxytocin that affects us so much when we are engaged in stories. It is really a source and a force to really cause us to want to change and want us to give, and all the things we're looking for when it comes to successful engagement. So the real issue, though, is engagement in the story is part of what we need to do, not a presentation of a point of view. And so we've drawn this canyon image many years ago, but if you can just take a look at it, it shows leaders at the top, it shows managers in the middle, it shows doers on the bottom right corner. And this is actually, and by the way, it shows a tornado that's really whipping change through this organization. We drew this picture because many people tell us this is what it feels like in their organization. In other words, leaders are all focused on the vision but don't have their hands on the day-to-day change. Managers are in the unenviable position of trying to receive and translate at the same time, and doers are just in the trenches trying to survive. The picture is rather provocative, but what happens when we begin to show this picture to people and engage them in a conversation versus a presentation? What we do often is that we talk about what's going on. The strategy is done. Now it's your time to execute. We also suggest that a manager might say, great, but what does this mean for me and my team? And finally, in a presentation, seriously, they don't get it, is what we often hear from the front line. But what would happen if we showed this picture to everybody in the organization and begin to ask them questions of discernment, of inquiry, and of judgment. So, for example, we have done this many times, and we ask people, what do you see? We ask them, what do you think the leaders see? We ask, what do you think the managers see? We ask in small groups, what do you think the doers see? And do they see the same thing? Why or why not? We ask, what's at the core of the canyons? We ask, how do you bridge the canyon? And we almost invoke the fire of conversation to make an organizational assessment of what's going on and what we need to do to address it. But the key is, and I think Jeff Bios has really figured this out, is that narrative is far more effective than any other method in engaging people. As a matter of fact, he's banned PowerPoints, and all of the meetings start typically with a 3-page narrative that team members read, and then they are in dialogue or conversation about it. When you think about this, one way to think about it is this, and William Isaacs is someone I'm a great fan of, and he is the author of The Art of Thinking Together. And he says the problems most organizations face can be directly traced to their inability to think and talk together. We've come up with another way to think about that, and that is we have never found this not to be true. And that is people will tolerate the conclusions of their leaders, but they will act on their own. So true engagement comes from creating not presentations, not PowerPoints, not agendas in town halls, not all-hand meetings where we need to get the messaging across, but leaders who decide that they need to create a mental practice field or a brain gym for their people to really begin to interact on the most pivotal challenges we face. And rather than tell them a story alone, engage them in the story in terms of how they contribute to it, how can they shape it, how can they form it, how can they change the last chapter of it. I have to be honest to tell you a story. We were working with a large Canadian bank, and at the large Canadian bank, we had used a visual not unlike the canyon you saw to look at the entire big picture of the marketplace of retail banking. And about an hour in, a woman had her head down and she said, "This is the first time I've ever learned anything in the 14 years I've been at this bank." And I said, "Excuse me?" And she came to life just like an amazing force, and she said, "Well, for the last 14 years, everything I've done at this bank was a one-way attempt for you to try to persuade me what to think. I don't hold any grudges, and I'm sure that your intentions were best for the organization and best for me in my role. But this is the first time you asked me to think, and the first time you've asked me to consider all the forces of our marketplace, to consider all the competitive and customer issues, and to begin to think through what our response ought to be." And she said in an amazing way, "You do know that learning requires thinking. And this is the first time that I've had to challenge my assumptions, began to look at my behaviors, and began to rethink how I believe I can contribute to our success." And then she said this statement, "You do know all of us around here will tolerate the conclusions that you have in presenting to us what you think we need to think versus causing us to actually begin to challenge our own thinking and therefore challenge our own behaviors. Because if we don't change our conclusions, we don't change our behaviors. And here's the key. People don't resist change. They just resist being changed by somebody else. And so how do we make sure that the change comes from our own thinking and our own engagement on the most pivotal challenges and stories we face in our organization? Now, one way to think about this is to think about it in the power of questions. So let me ask you this. When was the last time you were truly listened to? The woman at the Bank of Montreal could answer that instantly. When was the last time you felt your ideas were valuable? When was the last time you believed were critical to solving a problem? Now, how about this question? If we asked your people those three questions, how would they respond? Would they say yesterday? Would they identify the issue? Would they talk about the contribution? Or would they feel that they're just being led along to sort of implement somebody else's ideas? Now, the reality is the problems that even the most practical organizations face can be traced directly to their inability to talk and think together particularly at the most critical moments. So dialogue is the essence of engagement. I can tell you we can do all the surveys you want, you can do all the other things. I personally wonder if they're worth anything anymore. But having the dignity as an individual, to have a leader or a manager believe that if I was engaged in Socratic dialogue with open-ended questions, that I would have a powerful contribution to our success. Because in dialogue, people think together in relationships. It's a process for knowledge creation. It's shared inquiry by equals. It's the art of learning together. It's about listening and suspending. It's about seeking to uncover shared meaning. It's about harnessing the collective intelligence. It's about not only solving problems, but potentially dissolving them. It's about creating the capacity for new behavior. And here it is the oxygen of change. One of the things that we would ask is, what are the questions that really captivate people to engage them in dialogue? Now, this is fascinating. I was asked to speak to a bunch of sophomores in high school, and the way that I thought what I could possibly engage them on. I'm so far from a sophomore in high school, I thought this was going to be a disaster. So I just asked them the question, what are you most curious about in your life? And they blew me away. They asked questions like, when you die of natural causes, what do you die from? They asked, when you lose weight, where does the fat go? They asked, if it takes oxygen for a fire, how can the sun burn so brightly without any oxygen? They captivated imagination, but even more the conversation. So what are the questions about your organization? I mean, think of it this way. As a leader, your goal as a conductor of your people is not to tell them what to play, but to set up the conversations for them to co-think and engage in on the most pivotal issues you're facing. So some questions might be, where in your business should we self-attack or disrupt before our customers or competitors do? What strategic opportunities should be more aggressively going after? What should we stop doing to free up critical resources? There are just a number of them, but I can tell you this, if we asked, what are the most pivotal questions we face as a team or an organization, and then open a door for our people to address those, you would be dumbfounded at the untapped intelligence. I've had more leaders tell us we spent the last 10 years trying to teach our people how to do a better job, assuming it would improve our business, but we never introduced them to the drama and the adventure of our business. Why do we do that? Because if we did, they would respond in Technicolor. And they do, which is the core reason why they're often dumbfounded. The power of a question. A question is better at priming the collective intelligence of a group than a problem statement. It reframes a problem in a way that invites others to think and to take action. By the way, this issue of problem solving is really important. You know, if we had all of you in front of me, I would ask, how many of you do Sudoku puzzles? And some of you would raise their hands. And how many do crossword puzzles? And some would raise their hands. And I would ask, how many of you do video games? And some of you would raise your hand. And I would say, how many of you like to read novels? And some would raise their hands. And typically, 90% of the people have raised their hand at some point. Now I would ask, how many of you that do Sudoku or crossword or video games or read a novel, especially the games, go to the answer key before you address the puzzle or the crossword? And how many of you go to the last chapter of the book before you read the whole book? Most people would say, we don't. We would never go look at the answer key before we did the puzzle. And there always is somebody that reads the last chapter before the book, but the point is, why don't you do that? And if I asked, people would say very simple things, like, why bother? Or what's the challenge? Or it doesn't test me. Or it would be ridiculous. Yet in most cases, when we look at our most pivotal issues, whether they're strategies or whether they're priorities or whether they're objectives, what do? We give our people the answers and ask them to get excited about it. Well, instead of giving them the questions and asking them to rise to the occasion of addressing them in ways that we couldn't. Now, so what are the most strategic questions we should address more frequently and in depth? I mentioned these before, and so where in our business should we self-attack? What strategic opportunities we should be more aggressive? What should we stop doing to free up critical resources? But there's also paradoxical questions. Questions are, you know, where should we cut back and where should we invest? Where should we take risks? And where should we make sure that there is no risk whatsoever? I mean, there are all kinds of and questions that are pivotal to our people to really understand the challenges we face and make sense of them. One other way to think about this is this way, and it's to think about the mindset of a leader in engaging their people as a creator of creators, not as a creator of implementers. So what I mean by that is, if you are going to decide to not take the messaging or not take the answers or not even take the imperatives to your people in a fact, fear, and force kind of way, then you have to believe something. And what you have to believe is that if we take our most critical challenges to our people in the form of questions and dialogue, and by the way, more often in small groups, our experience has been small groups of 8 to 10, optimize the dialogue and the co-thinking and the collective intelligence of an organization. But if we are taking those questions to our people, that they will be able to come up with answers and opinions and ways to address those challenges better than we could ever script for them. Now, I want to repeat that because there's a lot of leaders that don't believe that. They don't believe that if we put the most pivotal questions on the table for our people to co-think in a form of a mental practice field or a brain gym, that in many regards they might not come up with better answers than we could script for them. We have found that to be totally wrong and totally false. We have found that many of the best leaders that really believe in engagement fundamentally believe that they're creators of creators. In other words, by uncorking their dormant human talent to address the most pivotal questions we face in our organization and step back so that they can respond to those, that people will come up with better answers than we could ever script for them. Now, part of that is because what we've always heard before, and that is those closest to the challenge may have the best answers. But part of it is also to appeal to the highest level of thinking of our people. And when we do that, to recognize that they respond in kind. They respond with creativity, they respond with innovation, they respond with passion, and they respond with ingenuity that we couldn't otherwise unleash or uncork. And so again, the whole issue of engagement is not about surveys. It's not about messaging. It's not about even just the one dimension of storytelling. It's about engaging our people in the dialogue so that they're participants in the story, so that they're co-crafters of that story, so that they're co-thinkers of that story, so that they're co-creators of the answers, and so that they do that in small groups so that the collective intelligence is constantly elevated to the next level and the responses we have to the challenges we face are dealt with in Technicolor. So I believe that we're probably close to the end on time. I've been told I had just about this much time. So, so now let's look at some of the questions and really look at this whole issue of engagement being about conversations, not presentations, of engagement being about, the most strategic questions, not about representing and presenting the most strategic answers. And recognizing that when we unleash that dormant human talent of our people, that their response far exceeds anything we could script for them. So, Meg?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. So let's get started on asking some questions. We actually already had a really great one come in, so I'm going to start with that.
Sure.
So how can you mitigate setting expectations with people by asking questions for their input that perhaps cannot be fulfilled?
Okay. Well, I think there's a couple parts to that. I don't think there's any problem when we ask questions of suggesting that there's some places that are non-negotiable and we've already decided. And the mistake would be if we've already decided, don't ask people to weigh into that. But one of the things, the question is, why are they not fulfilled? Why can't they be fulfilled? And I think we have sort of this long-term expectation that when we ask people to address questions, that they're going to come up with recommendations for somebody else. In other words, you know, they're going to come up with recommendations for their boss. They're going to come up with recommendations for leadership. They're going to come up with recommendations for the enterprise. And while I think that's okay, our experience has been when we ask people to sort of engage on the questions, more often than not, the recommendations they really want to focus on are the recommendations for what they can do in their area and act on those. We have found in many cases when we start this process, there are 3 buckets: outside my control, inside my control with help, and inside my control. And I think when we begin to ask a lot of questions, most people presume that most of what I'm going to uncover or suggest is going to be outside my control. But when you really pressure test that and really respect what people have to say and really want to hear, you find that there's this massive shift from 80% of it's outside my control to 80% of it is either in my control with help or completely inside my control. So I think, again, helping people begin to really understand that not only can they address the questions, but they can probably enact and probably are empowered to act on many of the suggestions or solutions that they come up with. And for let's just say it's 20%. For the 20% that you can't and that somebody else has to act, just focus on the areas you can. And I think it becomes a flywheel. We continue to believe that we have a lot more control over things than we ever thought we did. And again, the more leaders see how that response is, the more they back off and step back so others can step up.
Awesome. Another great question came in. So you mentioned small groups.
Yep.
8 to 10 is a proven, you know, method. So have you ever crowdsourced
Yes.
a large group conversation a la World Cafe, and what makes that work if it does?
Yep. No, I think you absolutely do. I mean, there's a lot of ways to crowdsource. You know, the simplest way these days, you know, is a word cloud, right? And so, you know, we've had thousands of people in a room and we ask questions and the word cloud gives you some dimension of that, and so I think that's valuable. I think we can crowdsource for perspective. I think we can crowdsource for emphasis. I think the only challenge that I've seen sometimes with crowdsource, it can really bring out a feeling and it really can bring out an issue and it really can bring out an emphasis, but now we want to really engage in that conversation about that, which is often connecting the dots and thinking holistically and thinking systemically. And so sometimes that becomes a little more difficult in a crowd. It can be done if you set it up well, but I think that's why we, you know, if we have 1,000 people, we may ask 1,000 people some questions and crowdsource that, but then we may take the 1,000 and just break it into, you know, X number of tables of 8 to 10 and still have them engage in the dialogue, and then go back to crowdsourcing some of the summaries of the dialogue. So it's just that the way the interactivity, you know, where can we use technology, and that can really accelerate the value of the conversation, and where does the small group really sort of, you know, the word dialogue is dialogus. The meaning comes out, and so it's in those conversations that the meaning comes out in the small groups, and it can in a large group. You just have to decide, you know, make sure that you've framed it well so you get what you're looking for out of it.
Awesome. So I will say, I know we're 2 minutes before time. If you do have to jump off, we totally understand. Everyone's going to be getting a recording of this webinar, but we do have a couple of questions I'd love to keep chatting through. So for those of you that want to stay on, we will keep rolling through the questions. And I will be sending you, as I said, a recording of the webinar. So if you have any other questions, if you do have to jump off, feel free to contact me and we can keep the conversation going. So.
I like this. Can I answer this question right here?
Yeah, the last one.
Well, there's two, but the one is, I love this question. When you are co-creating, how do you move from dialogue with your direct reports to making a decision? We have a process that we've used that just has worked fabulously well, and that is, you know, I think, let's assume that there's 8 people, and let's assume there's a critical issue. And so the 3-step that often gets used is, the first one is to really frame the information of the issue, and so let's just call it the fact base. And let's assume we have 8 people. And then there's 2 passes. The first pass is everybody can only ask clarifying questions and you can only ask it in your turn. That seems really disciplined, you know, but it's fascinating. What happens in that leadership thinking together is that after a while, you know, people stop waiting for other people to be done talking so that they can talk, and they start listening to each other. You know, most of us don't listen to understand, we listen to respond. You've got to break that curse. And so there's a discipline around you can only ask clarifying questions, and only in your turn. And as you go, you begin to really understand that. And then the second pass is you make recommendations. We have found that at least 90% of the time, if the fact base is there, if the clarifying questions really sort of is the engine of the dialogue, so you ask the questions and you know, the person that brought in the information answers them. And then the third is you provide recommendations, because it's so holistic in its concept and you learn so much from each other that the recommendations just become powerful, and they become somewhat synergistic rather than debates at odds. And if we find if it's still 50-50, then there's something about the issue we're not addressing appropriately, because it ends up being 90-10, 80-20 almost all the time when it's done that way.
I think that leads into this next question pretty nicely. So the varied input you get when you ask people to weigh in could become a beast to sort through. What do leaders do with the feedback, and how do you manage it in a way that brings about meaningful solutions?
Yeah, you know, it's really a good question. I mean, the first answer to that is, you know, don't ask a question that you don't want, you know, to hear what people have to say. I think that becomes really important. And I think you also be precise in what problem you think we're solving for. I can't tell you how many times we began a dialogue and we thought we queued it up under one issue, and it really wasn't the issue, so it changed. But the leaders we work with, and I can tell you, whether it's in a group of 1,000, which we've done this with, you know, or a group of something less than that. Well, let's just say a team, okay? What do leaders do with feedback? I think they make it transparent. So we have something called a wall of reality, where we ask people to provide feedback, and then we assemble all that feedback on Post-it notes on a wall, and we ask people to look at all of that, and we ask them to tell the story of all of that information. We ask them to emphasize it, so they get checks. So where would you put checks on the elements of this that are most important? And then we ask them to draw conclusions from the most, you know, prolific check marks. And again, I think it's a way to get people to understand the whole, to sort out the emphasis, and then to bring sort of clarity to what that means. And we really don't find ourselves fighting on the outliers. We think, you know, but you got to make it transparent. You need everybody to see the whole. It's almost like we often tell a story where people think leaders are all screwed up, and when we ask people that, why do they think leaders are screwed up, they say, well, it's because they send a different piece of a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle across the table every week. You know, one says delight customers, one says cut costs. You know, all these things say that they're almost an opposite. And they ask, why don't they ever send the cover of the box top of the puzzle across so we can see how it all fits together? My point being, when people can see how it all fits together, they have to think systemically about it, and they can't just land on their one strong preference or point of view. And now all of a sudden, it has to be blended into a holistic concept. And you find that people are very capable of doing that if you provide the mechanism for them to see the cover of the box top.
Great. Well, it looks like that was our final question. So I just want to thank everyone for joining us today. This was a really good discussion. We hope you learned some valuable tips on how to drive engagement throughout your organization. So as I mentioned before, you will all be receiving this recording. Please feel free to follow up with me if you have any additional thoughts or questions. And I'm also going to provide a link for you to the website for Leadership Blind Spots. There'll be information about the book and information on how to buy the book in case you don't have it already. So feel free to check that out. And again, thanks for joining us today. Any final thoughts, Jim?
You know, I see a couple other questions I'd love to answer. So if anybody wants to go offline. Well, there's a question here. Death by PowerPoint is a real thing, but within a large organization, i.e. a bank, at times the first thing asked is where is the deck, or create a deck, and as if it's the Holy Grail. So how do you convince or help leaders really change a culture of how info is presented and how the doers push back and suggest PowerPoint is not necessary. What a great question. I mean, I think there's so many people that, you know, that they just go to the deck. I think there's kind of there's not an academic answer to this. There is only one answer that I've seen most pivotal, and that is the leader has to have an experience that suggests that by setting it up as the 7 most critical questions or a series of critical questions and observing people engage in those questions, they have to have an aha. You know, I jokingly say, you know, leaders are learners too. And what they've learned is that they've got to get the message out and they've got to check that box. But if they can break that mold and that mindset, and if they can watch people do that, it would be profound. I got to tell you a story. We were working with a large insurance company that was demutualizing, and the CEO had just spent a ton of money getting all the information right to the market because they're going IPO. And we had a bunch of customer service, actually they were new customer service people, go through a process of questions and dialogue about the future of the business. And I told the CEO, you can observe, but you don't say anything because I learned later that they didn't even know who he was and they really didn't care. So, but the net of it was he started taking notes. He started taking notes and more notes. And so we finished, and I said, "Why did you take all those notes?" He goes, "I've learned more from these frontline customer service people in the last 40 minutes than I did from the hundreds of thousands of dollars I paid for consultants to tell me how to sort of go forward with the story of this." He said, "They're profoundly informed and creative about what we need to do, and their comments were better than any of the other ones I paid for." And so the point being is, once he had that experience, which was a dialogue-based experience, you know, he began to say, you know, we're not going to do a presentation. We're going to ask about what is the conversation, what are the questions we need people to really wrestle with to help them decide how we approach this. But the only thing I would say, find some way to have a small experiment of that a leader can watch, and do it in a way that they have a sort of an aha, and then it opens the door tremendously. And that's probably the best answer I can give. And again, it doesn't have to be 100 people, or it doesn't have to be 1,200 people. 5 or 6 or 8 people, and just have them experience that in some capacity.
Great. I think that was a great way to close it out. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us. If you have any further questions, feel free to follow up.